and we're going to hit record in three, two. Welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we get to interview authors and entrepreneurs all over the world. I love talking to authors because they have the courage to take their thoughts, their stories, their lessons, and put it down in a book for the world to read, ultimately changing their legacy and destiny in the process. And if you're looking to write a book out there, check out Dream Starters Publishing. We can help you out with wherever you're at in the process. And if you already have a book and you want to generate leads with it, check out bookmarketingcrm.com. Now, as you know, this podcast is really set for entrepreneurs looking to start or grow a business. And we're capitalists by nature, okay? And so, I like to hear from other people with different perspectives on things that might make me a little bit nervous. Now, in society, we hear this growing term of socialism and how good it is for people. And there's a guest that we're going to have on that knows quite a bit about this, including the history and the books that he is a part of: The Road to Socialism and Back, The Free Enterprise Welfare State, and The Road to Freedom. I guess he's a historian by nature, so it is an honor to have Matt Mitchell with us today. Thanks so much for being here, man.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, let's start off with the genesis of this book. Now, as you know, like I told you before you even hit record, that I'm a free market guy. I'm a capitalist. So I respect you for coming on and talking about your books. But what made you want to sit down and write these books in the first place?
Well, I mean, much of it is kind of what you were saying there a second ago. This is the idea that never dies, and it's sort of this mystique about socialism, and young people in particular are intrigued by it. One of the things that we did actually for the project is we conducted surveys in the US, Canada, Australia, and the UK. And something like 50% of 18 to 34-year-olds in these countries think that socialism would be a better system than they currently have. With the number of people with a working memory of the Berlin Wall falling and what actual socialism was like, increasingly dwindling, we felt like the time was right to do a series on what were the realities of socialism. What was it actually like?
Nice. And so, can you give us a quick little background on where you come from and maybe what got you to where you're at now? I mean,
Yeah.
just a quick little rundown through that.
Sure. So I'm actually an economist is by training. I got my PhD at George Mason University. And Mason at Mason, I was fortunate enough to study under Nobel laureates like James Buchanan and his colleague Gordon Tullock, and these are folks who studied the effects of institutions on human behavior, the effects of politics on human behavior. They looked at politics often through this lens of thinking of it like a market, like how are votes bought and sold. And so, kind of with this as a background and an interest, I really got fascinated in the idea of what is it that makes some societies fabulously wealthy and other societies, desperately poor. And what makes some societies, like what we're going to talk about today, Estonia or Poland, desperately poor and then fabulously wealthy. How does that happen? How does that transition happen? Once you start thinking about it, as one economist has put it, it's almost impossible to think about anything else.
So yeah, and I like how you preface by saying 18 to 34-year-olds are obsessed with it. They believe that's the right system, right? And the way I look at it is, what is the most sought after country in the world? What if there's a beacon of hope and in light? I always think it's America. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, people go to towards freedom, and this is pretty clear in the data. People leave countries that are less free, and they go to countries that are more free. The United States is at the top of the list. It's actually not the absolute freest country in the world, but it has the longest run of being a large country with a mostly free economy, and people want to come here as a result of that.
And the way I look at it, especially in the origin of this country, is that it's equal opportunity. It's freedom for you to go after your own dreams, but not equal outcome. And so I think that's what makes it exciting for people like myself, that, yeah, we're in this race, but it is a race, right? We're all looking to produce the best result. And if I work 80 hours a week, but the person next to me works 1 hour a week, I deserve, right? I should reap a harvest that person shouldn't. So there's individuals who can come to America to say, if I'm a hard worker, I'm going to win here. And I think that that is why people look down on socialism, because I think most people think of socialism as, well, that means basically everybody's treated equally. No matter what I do, that person's going to get the same. All right, well, then the hell with it. I'm going to throw my hands up in the air and I'm going to give up just like they did. Now, that's what I
Mhm.
think of. Do you think that's a common sentiment out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I think one of the sort of tweaks I might make to what you said is that, the amount of work we put into it is actually not what we're paid for. Arguably, actually, that comes from the idea of the labor theory of value with which Karl Marx subscribed to. What our pay comes from volunteerism. It comes from other people who find what we do valuable and being willing to voluntarily give us their resources, their money. You could think of their votes in terms of dollars. And that's what success is. So, and as it turns out, I mean, you're 100% right in that if you want to be successful, hard work is really got to be at the core of it. But you need to be working hard to please others, to serve others. So, ironically, if you think of the word socialism, it has this origins in the idea of society and working for others, and we're all coming together. Ironically, a free enterprise society, if there were any justice in the English language, that should be known as a socialist society because it's about serving others. The only way I can gain resources, the only way I can become wealthy is by creating value for others. In a socialist society, ironically, it was about serving yourself. The only way that you could gain resources was actually, if you were a factory manager, was to withhold goods from the consumer and then sell it on the black market by essentially cheating the system was the way to get ahead. So in many ways, there's a lot of paradoxes once you start digging into it. But the reality of socialism was so much closer to Marx's critique of capitalism than anything else. It's really pretty astounding.
So overall, what's your viewpoints on socialism? And what drew you to this, just the curiosity in this world?
Well, I mean, I think the evidence is just abundant that socialism doesn't work. It doesn't work, at least in the terms of that the socialists laid out. Their claim was not just that this would be a system that would create social equality, but also that it would be a system that would outproduce capitalism. They really thought like it was really inefficient to have a bunch of firms competing and making the same type of product. Like that seemed redundant to them. It seemed really silly to have people making their own plans when we could have some kind of overarching plan that would sort of force everybody to go in the same path. So, famously, the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, took off his shoe and banged it on the table at the United Nations and said, "We will bury you." He actually was not being militaristic. It wasn't a threat. He was claiming that he thought socialism would outcompete capitalism. That's what they believed, and the evidence just isn't there when you dig into it. Nor is there evidence that it led to any kind of social equality in the sense that people seem to care about.
Yep.
If you look at the Soviet elite, they were called the nomenklatura. This comes from the idea of like your name is on a list, essentially. And they got to while shortages of everyday goods were just commonplace throughout the socialist world. Everything from meat to cosmetics to soap to clothes to cars to steel and rubber, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The nomenclatura didn't have to deal with that. They could shop in their own special shops where they could buy Western goods that were unavailable to everyone else. The elite throughout the communist world were able to have their own healthcare systems that actually served them in a way that everybody else did not have. They had their own savings accounts. They had access to elite spas and hunting grounds. They had access to luxury goods from limousines to huge apartments and dachas and things like that. And of course, they didn't pay any taxes. And of course, that was a state secret, and that was something that was not allowed, that the public was not allowed to know. So if you just evaluate socialism on the terms of socialists, on the things that they claim to care about, the system falls really far short of what was promised.
Totally agree with you, man. And so I was, I didn't know exactly where you stood. Obviously, I could see what you have in these books here, but the more the more you research it, probably the more evidence that you're able to obtain. And so, if you can give a quick little, maybe brief on the history of it. I mean, the only thing I can think of it starts off with whether it's Karl Marx or whenever it comes, I think that starts to get people to fall in love with the act of what is it, the bureaucrats versus the proletariats, or however that he phrased it. You're starting to see that become the trend, and it's in the 1800s, obviously into the 1900s, that it becomes part of our I guess lexicon, our
Yeah.
language. So, can you give us a brief history on where it actually starts? When does it become popular?
So, Marx and Engels are by far the most famous, socialist intellectuals, and they wrote in the mid part of the 19th century. The idea of socialism, though, had actually predated them a couple hundred years, and we had experiments of socialism even in the United States. But one of the things that's key here is a lot of these experiments about socialism that had happened before, particularly in the U.S. and Canada, they are not state socialism. Okay, they are small voluntary societies where people got together and tried a little social experiment to see, could we make this work? People could leave at any time that they wanted, right? They were often religious based. They were often, had a very specific culture to them. Interestingly enough, Marx dismissed that. And Marx's followers called that utopian socialism. His socialism, he said, was scientific. I actually think there's another way you really should flip it around, because at least the folks in the US that were trying it, they were running experiments. That's what we think of as science today, right? Is you do an experiment. It didn't really work, but we did an experiment. Marx, on the other hand, it's almost more of a religion. So for him, the idea is he had scientifically, he thought, shown that society has this logic in terms of its order. You have a feudal society, and that gives way to to a capitalist society. And then capitalism produces a great deal of wealth. Marx conceded that much, but it also exploits the worker and has all these other problems. And so then that will inevitably, inexorably lead to socialism. He thought this would just it was like clockwork. It was
so unbelievable.
He knew the future. And then from socialism, and it's really a state-centered socialism. So it's not like, the experiments that were going on in North America where you could leave. This was what you had to, it was top-down dictated. So from there, it would lead to worldwide socialism. You'd have a worldwide socialist state. Eventually, and that Lenin contributed to that idea of this international kind of socialism. And then eventually the state would wither away. It would go away, and you then have this utopia of communism. And so Lenin comes along, and so Marx is German. He's writing in the 19th century. Half a century or more later, Lenin comes along, and he wants socialism in Russia. Now, there was a problem. Russia had never been capitalist. It had never developed the way Marx said it would. And so Lenin modifies it a little bit, and he says we have to have a dictatorship of the proletariat. We have to have the people take power by force and impose socialism at the point of a gun. And even in Marx, you have the idea of imposing socialism at a point of a gun, because of course people have property and they want to keep it.
Right.
And Marx and
the farmers.
Marx and Engels have this, one of the things they say is the idea of socialism can be summed up in one sentence: abolition of private property. So, if you're going to take away people's property, you got to use force. And so Lenin then wants to have this dictatorship of the proletariat, to impose it and then, disseminate it throughout the world. So, what we're studying in particular, we're zooming in on the case of Estonia and Poland. But these are places where where the Soviet Union invaded, and essentially imposed communism at the point of a gun, socialism at the point of a gun, with the idea that it would liberate the people, that it was for their own good.
Truly
And then,
amazing.
at one point in the 20th century, you have 1/3 of the entire population living under one socialist regime or another, from communist China to Cuba.
And so in your book, is this the newest one? 2023 is the one that, yeah. Oh, no, you have ones 2024. So I'm looking at the
Mhm.
one from July 19th, which is I guess, the start of this series. And it's the history of Poland. So 1939. All right. The insanity that's happening in the world at this time. So you're telling me, or start off, I guess, what is happening in 1939 in Poland?
Okay, so one thing you need to do is go back to an interesting meeting in Moscow. So August 23rd, 1939, Herr von Ribbentrop, who's the German foreign minister, the foreign minister for the Nazi government, he's invited to Moscow and he lands. He's greeted by 6 giant swastika flags that the Soviet Union is proudly displaying for him. The Soviets had recently repurposed these flags. They had been used in anti-Nazi propaganda films, but now they were there to greet von Ribbentrop. He's rushed to the Kremlin, where he meets with his counterpart. The Russian counterpart was Molotov. Molotov, by the way, got his job because Stalin had sacked his predecessor, who was Jewish. This was a conciliatory gesture to Hitler. And they signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, otherwise known as the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Now, ostensibly, it just agrees it's a non-aggression pact. We won't attack you, you won't attack us. But importantly, it includes what are called secret protocols. And in these secret protocols, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany agree to split up Europe into spheres of influence. And they basically draw a line down the middle of Europe. The Soviet Union gets everything to the east, and Germany gets everything to the west. And so they're secret protocols that are denied by the Soviet Union for another half century. Even Gorbachev denied them until he eventually admitted that they did exist. And under these protocols, they agree to jointly invade Poland. And so they do so in 1939. Germany
Wow.
invades from the west, Soviet Union from the east. By the end of the month, they have Poland under their control. The Nazis and the Soviets come together in a town called Brest-Litovsk, and they hold a joint Nazi-Soviet parade celebrating their victory. So this is the beginning of World War II. We always think of the Soviet Union as being on the side of the
The
Allies.
Allies. Yeah.
They were eventually, but that's only because it's often said that Stalin's greatest mistake was to trust Hitler, and that Hitler's greatest mistake was to double-cross Stalin. But that's exactly what happened. So they take over Poland, divide it up. Then the Soviets move on to Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania and the other Baltic states, and they basically dragoon them into the Soviet Union. Within about a year or so, the Nazis then turn on their erstwhile allies and they attack Moscow. So that shuffles things up, but it ends up, that was the start of World War II, and that was the introduction of socialism into Eastern Europe.
Holy smokes. Okay, so I had no idea. I mean, they didn't teach that in school, right? You always heard Soviet Union is on the side of the Allies, even though they were our enemies. We had one common enemy, which was, I guess you consider it was fascism, with the way they broke it down, right? So Nazis, fascism. So,
Well, and Nazism, of course, it stands for National Socialism.
so
So,
socialism, yes, all right,
the
but
two are not all that dissimilar, even though and part of this comes from Hitler and Stalin themselves. Hitler wanted to portray Stalin as the exact opposite of him, and Stalin wanted to portray Hitler as the exact opposite of them. But they clearly had quite a bit in common, right down to the name. They were both national, they were both socialists.
yeah. So I mean, the school systems really keep that out. They don't ever want to say Nazi was socialist, but it's in the damn name, right?
Yeah. And you can actually go to the Holocaust website, the Holocaust Memorial website, where they have the Nazi platform, and you can see there's a half a dozen planks in this 16 plank platform that are live up to the socialism half of the Nazis of the National Socialist name. Hitler, wanted to nationalize industry. He wanted to take over private enterprise. He wanted to control prices and control interest rates. All of these are just, pretty standard socialist maneuvers.
And so Poland, you said they become under so I guess you could say there's the battle, right, over who runs Poland then? Is it basically the Soviet side? I would assume that it's the German side because that right? German.
So essentially what happens is they're divided for a while, and then the Germans turn on Russia and kick the Russians out. The Germans are in control for a couple of years. Absolutely horrific. This is where it's really in Poland, where the Holocaust begins.
Yes.
Wipes out the Jewish community. Then the Soviets reinvade and push the Germans out. Now, interestingly enough, you've got, even there, you've got cynical things like one of the most successful homegrown resistance efforts was in Poland, the Warsaw Uprising. These are Polish, mostly Jewish peasants, or not peasants, urban, very low income people fighting back against the Nazis, and very cynically, the Soviets did not aid them. And in fact, they wouldn't allow the British to come in and aid them because they preferred to have the Nazis wipe everybody out, so that then when they came in and controlled Poland, it was a weaker society and it would be easier to control. So just mind-blowing the depravity that went on both sides, during World War II. So they took over. They agree with that in their meetings with Churchill and Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt, Stalin says, we're going to ensure democracy, and they just don't. So they set up entirely what are called, puppet states. All of the top leaders in the Polish government were, come from Russia or the Russian military, or have ties to the Russian communists. And for the next, half century, 40 years or so, they're under the thumb of the Soviet Union, even though they are ostensibly their own state. And this is enforced, by the way, by this idea of that, and they set several precedents in Czechoslovakia and Hungary and elsewhere. Whenever a satellite state tried to depart from socialism, the Soviets invaded. And so this idea was sort of enforced again at the point of the gun. So they are part of the Warsaw Pact, where they are sort of allies with the Soviets, but they're allies by force.
And so I've always thought that the real goal of any socialist is to turn it to a communist nation. And the only reason why you'd want to do that is because it gives those in control more power, bigger government, right? There's more control, more authority, there's more of a separation, and it destroys the middle class. Anytime you hear the word socialist or socialism, I'm always thinking, well, it's basically you have the people in power, and then you start to have the social structure of, well, it's very close to communism. Fascism to me is taking by force, and I guess that's the real definition of it. Very, very similar to what you just said, held up by gunpoint for private property, abolition of private property. And then when it comes to the communism play, am I right that they only keep preaching socialism in our schools and on our media, because the real goal is to get us into that two class structure, right? Get rid of the middle class, because middle class is pretty much they're still somewhat free thinkers, but if you have the elite and the poor, now you have division, now you have control. So am I right about that?
So, I mean, it's hard to get into the minds of some people. When you look at the history of it, you do clearly find people who are true believers. They just simply thought that this would be a better system, that it would, create undreamed of wealth, that it would create equality, that it would mean that workers were no longer exploited. As the system wears on, cynicism kind of creeps in, because one problem is, in order to take control of what people buy and sell and how they work, you have to control what they think and what they read and what they do. And so it ends up, bleeding into all aspects of society. One just totally mind-boggling example of this is the disastrous experiment of collective housing. So throughout the Soviet Union, if you lived in a place, in a dwelling where you had more than 9 square feet, 9 square meters. So think about that. That's 3 by 3, 3 meters by 3 meters. That was considered, too bourgeois. And so your house, your family might have lived in that house for centuries. Your house was taken over and more families were brought in. Or sometimes you were told to get out of your house entirely and you have to go stay in this apartment. But what they would do typically, though, is they would create apartment buildings out of houses where they would house 3 or 4 families in a place that only had housed 1. Each family gets a bedroom, so you'd have 3, up to 3 generations living in 1 bedroom. Everybody has to share the kitchen. Everybody has to share the toilet, and then, if you were a member of the elite, if you were an intellectual, you read books, you were maybe wealthy, or you ran a business before communism, then those people, they often would move in. Secret police were the roommates. So KGB, or the predecessor of the KGB, was the NKVD. And they were there to spy on you. So, we have stories, sorry about that. So we have stories of, people who, they had been exiled to Siberia. And they actually said coming back and having to live in a collective apartment was actually worse than exile, because at least exile, you're on your own. You kind of have some freedom. You're maybe eating grass and digging a hole in the ground in order to keep warm, but you don't have somebody watching you constantly. That's what I mean by this sort of control problem. There's a meandering question. Back to your meandering answer. Back to your question. I think by the end of the 70s and 80s, it was pretty hard to find anybody in the Soviet Union who was still a true believer. At that point, it was a lot more cynicism.
But it's so attractive, and maybe it was attractive back then, but it's attractive now, because you mean to tell me that I have all this privilege? People owe me this. I have so many rights for X, Y, and Z that's been brainwashed in me. It's the easier path, right? I mean, if you think about it, do I really want to be told to work hard for a living, or do I want somebody to take care of me? And if I was just born into a certain existence without understanding work ethic, and I saw somebody who has all the stuff that I want, it's much easier for me to say, well, I'd rather just you take it from that person and give it to me because I deserve it. It's attractive. Is that it?
I think there's part of that. I think early on, none of the socialists, the true believers, were motivated by the idea of not working. They actually thought that this would be far more productive. And so they put in, essentially, they tried to create a culture of shock work, they called it. So they built this, there were several cults, essentially, throughout the Soviet Union, where they have, obviously there's a cult of personality around Stalin himself. We should talk about the cults around children who oppose their parents. That's fascinating, dark history. But there was a cult around the shock workers, especially they called them Stakhanovites, after there was a worker, Stakhanov, who supposedly could move gargantuan sums of amounts of coal. And so what they did was, the initial idea was, we're just going to work these people and outproduce the capitalists, and it's going to lead to prosperity later. So the selling point was not necessarily that you can't work, or that you won't have, don't worry, you won't have to work much. In fact, being unemployed was illegal.
Wow.
So it was the idea that we're all going to work and we're all going to outproduce. And in a way, they kind of were, I think they fooled themselves into thinking that they were outproducing the capitalists because, if you steal resources, you force people to work, you create slave labor. Something like 16 to 18% of the Soviet Union labor force was complete slave labor. You can do some stuff, right? You can make slaves built the pyramids. Slaves managed to build an economy in the American South. You can make stuff through slavery. But the problem is you don't end up making useful stuff that consumers want, which gets back to our initial idea, what we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation, which is in a free enterprise system, the way you get wealthy is serving people. And the problem is they weren't serving the people. They were just making they made rockets that could go to Venus, and they made intercontinental ballistic missiles, and they made giant statues to Lenin and Stalin, but they didn't make anything that people actually wanted. The products were shoddy. They were always in short demand, or they were always in shortage, and it didn't serve the actual people that it was supposed to serve.
Wealth through servitude. That is the greatest definition of capitalism that I've ever read. So, yeah, whenever I heard that, I'm like, yeah, that's the perfect way of explaining it. And socialism to me is, like you said, you eloquently said in the beginning, it's not really about service to others. It's preservation of self. Right?
Yeah.
It's so weird how that happens. But you did bring up a very good point about the youth, and I think there is a trend that happens whenever it comes to whether it's Poland, or in your book about Denmark or the Soviet vassal state. Well,
Mm-hmm.
there's probably a trend, and my thought is that you have to get to the kids first. You have to get to the education, the kids, whether it's in school or the college level, but you have to change one generation. And there's a great video of a KGB individual on, I think it was TV in 1983, 1984, explaining how they brainwash people, and there's demoralization, and there's a crisis, and then there's this thing called the new normal that takes place. Therefore, oh, this is how it's supposed to be. It's always been this way. So there's a trend and there's a playbook. Can you explain that? Maybe if you want to go back to what they do to the youth.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, what they needed to do was to essentially wipe out any kind of civil society that wasn't controlled by the state. So, the definition, my favorite definition of totalitarianism is one by Benito Mussolini, which is everything within the state, nothing against the state. That's the idea of totalitarianism. And so they outlawed everything from private art to civil societies, to temperance societies, that kind of thing. And everything had to be controlled by the state, even down to if you wanted to paint. You want to paint a picture, you got to be a member of the Communist Party in good standing, because they controlled the means of production. And if you wanted access to paints and brushes and canvas, you had to be in good standing with them, and
Unbelievable.
they wanted you to paint. So when it came to kids, they outlawed the Boy Scouts, which actually, we think of that as kind of like a Western. Boy Scouts was sort of a Western thing, but it's not. It was all around the world, very popular in Europe. And they created their own version of it. They were called the Pioneers. And they were taught that you serve the state, you serve the community, and your parents, that they may not. And in fact, if your parents are saying things like, oh, it was better under capitalism, you need to report them. That's your duty. That's your responsibility. So a good example of this is this kid, Pavlik. Pavlik, I think his name was Morozov. And he was a young kid, Pavlik Morozov, who had denounced his father. He was encouraged to do so, of course, by the people, and sort of a ridiculous denouncement. Like his father was I think a blue collar worker, welder, or something like that. And, he was claiming that he was at the heart of this international, conspiracy involving the CIA, and like sort of a ridiculous claim. Turned his father in. His father was executed. And later, Pavlik himself, he was only 14, he was murdered. And we actually don't know the circumstances. At the best we can tell, he was probably murdered over a gun, a dispute over a gun with another kid. But the state got a hold of the story and built it into this idea that he was murdered by his family for betraying his father.
Oh my God. Oh my
And so
propaganda.
throughout the Soviet Union, they then erected statues of little Pavlik, the communist hero who loved his country and loved communism so much that he turned in his own father. And this is the kind of story that they wanted to exemplify and build up. That is the ideal. So it gets to the idea of what a lot of people call this culture, essentially, of whispering. Children, of course, are, if you've been around kids, they'll tell you everything that's going on in their household, right? And all the dirty secrets. Kids are the ones who are going to reveal it. And so they used kids as a way to undermine society, the structures of capitalist society as they saw it. And there's terrible stories. There's stories of people who, their family. We tell the story of a couple in Estonia where the husband, his father had been arrested as an enemy of the people, and an enemy of the people was just somebody who had been somewhat successful before communism. And he was so ashamed. He grew up in the system and was so ashamed that his father had been an enemy of the people that he didn't reveal this to his wife. Finally, Berlin Wall falls, communism ends. It's the 90s, and he reveals to his wife that his parents had been enemies of the people. And his wife said, "My parents too."
Oh my
These people
God.
had lived together for half a century and never shared that part of themselves because they were so terrified by the totalitarian state.
That is insane. So the snitches, I mean, if you look at what even happened in 2020 with everything with the masks and the vaccine, it is so similar, right? You are incentivizing the snitching and saying this
Yeah.
person's not doing this. And that's the brainwashing. But there's two aspects of that. Number one, you got to go after the kids. You have to get the kids on board, right? Because you can get them easily on board because they don't know anything else.
Yeah.
So who's going after the kids? Start to pay attention to that, but also who is the state saying is the hero? It's amazing that I look at the media and I look at Hollywood and I look at maybe the government that is showcasing heroes, and you
Mm-hmm.
could see the writing on the wall of what they want to incentivize, and it's not so great for the average
Yeah.
person, right? It's just two ingredients right there.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the other element here is that, as Lord Acton famously said, power corrupts. But I would point out power also discriminates. So, ultimately, when you have this enormous amount of power in the state, it's going to end up being used to oppress particular people or particular groups. So throughout the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union was like a confederation of states with up to 15 different states: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Russia. But there was always one state that was more equal than the rest, and that was Russia. The resources went to the Russians. The Russians were supposed to know how, they knew communism, they knew socialism better than anybody else, and they were going to teach it to everybody else. And so it was discrimination in favor of Russians and against all other groups. Later, there was discrimination against, of course, there's discrimination against anybody who had been successful. There was discrimination against intellectuals. There's discrimination later, even against ethnic groups like Jews, simply because Stalin himself was anti-Semitic. So, you just have, here it is, undermining the main goal of socialism. The one good thing you might be able to say about socialism is, well, but at least it's trying to make people, create a society of equals, and it really wasn't.
Is there any other common theme amongst whether it's Poland or Denmark or Soviet Vassal that you see when it comes to easy to notice playbook strategies, such as class warfare? I'm thinking they always have to pinpoint different classes against each other, but also I'm assuming there's always got to be some type of I don't know, maybe there's a medical situation, some type of crisis, right? There's got to be, whether it's, I mean, you look at the climate, there's got to be some type of crisis that they're trying to fix. In order to do that, they need to do X, Y, and Z to the enemies. So, any other
Yeah.
thing you can share with us?
Yeah. So one thing there almost always was a cult of personality. And so whether it was Stalin himself or his successors or, Mao in communist China, there's always somebody who ends up, even though it's supposed to be, socialism for everyone, it ends up being that they're extolling the individual at the top. And sort of in ridiculous ways. If you read, I mean, the North Koreans and the mythology around Mao in China is just absolutely bizarre. Even in North Korea, they put out the myth that Kim actually does not go to the bathroom. He's almost godlike that he doesn't even use the restroom. So there's that. I think another element is always this idea of, yes, we're going to sacrifice now, but it'll be worth it in the future.
Yes.
And it'll all be worth it. So don't worry. And then interestingly enough, if you think about some of the things I actually kind of admire about the cultural left, the idea of, respecting everybody irrespective of their, race or their, sexual orientation or anything like that. You think about those types of things. Interestingly enough, communist states tended to set those values aside. They tended to be almost fall back on this idea of, we know best. Any deviation from the norm is wrong. Rock music is wrong. If you, outlawing homosexuality, of course, they had to do that. Ultimately, they end up controlling huge portions of the society, even those portions that they said, you wouldn't think have anything to do with economics.
Any correlation between lack of religion and belief in government? Because I'm thinking, when I look at atheist nations, atheist countries, there's always a belief in government. There's a stronger, like, the government will take care of me rather than God. So I'm assuming
Yeah,
that's part of it.
that is part of it, really just by force. So they could tolerate no other organizing principle of society, and so religion really had to be made either illegal or at least highly suppressed and limited. Now, the interesting thing, one of the reasons why Poland is such an interesting story, though, is because it's a quite Catholic society, especially, unfortunately, after the Nazis had cleared out almost so much of the Jewish population. So it's a very Catholic society. And in 1978, the Catholic Church selected a Polish priest as its new pope. So Pope John Paul II.
Wow.
And the Soviet Union, Pope John Paul II becomes the new pope, and he wants to visit his homeland. And the Soviet Union, they were a little bit reluctant, but they basically let it happen. The Poles, really, the Polish leadership went to their bosses in the Soviet Union and said, we got to do this. We have to the people will riot if we don't let him come in. And he is very deft and he's very astute. And he comes in and he doesn't say, throw the communists out, because he couldn't quite get away with that. But he says, be not afraid. And everybody knew exactly what he was talking about.
Oh, yeah.
Afraid of the communists. You're bigger than them. You're more than them. You're more numerous. And he said, have solidarity in the people. And, shortly thereafter, there was a woman who was had been a dedicated socialist, and she saw her boss stealing. And so she reported him. And they arrested her and fired her. And everybody was just this was in a factory where they were making, I think, shipbuilding. And everybody protested and said, this is crazy. This woman was doing the right thing. And so they started a union, and they called it Solidarity, based on Pope John Paul's suggestion that you find solidarity with one another. And within a year, 1/3 of the entire country was part of this union, and the union was pushing. It was the first non-state sanctioned union in all of the empire, the Soviet Empire, and they were pushing for more freedoms. And so the communists cracked down. It was called the Long December Night in December 1981, where they arrested all the leaders. And it looked like it was sort of the union was broken. But even as they did it, they arrested the leaders of this union. The union, leaders said, "This is the last nail in the coffin of communism. You've overstepped your bounds." And it might have looked like, oh, that was crazy, a little bit optimistic, but over the long run, they were absolutely right. They overreacted. They tried to suppress this sort of civil protest, and it ended up really taking down the entire regime. Long answer to your question, they tried to suppress religion, but in many ways, religion was what helped sort of lead the revolution against communism.
I love it, man. You okay on time? Am I able to ask one more
Oh yeah,
question?
we're good.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated with this. Usually it's only like 35, 40 minutes, but I can keep going. I want to learn about this
Yeah.
stuff because it helps me understand what they have in store for us. Anyways, when it comes to food production, I also believe that one way to really implement socialism to boost up the support for communism is to maybe diminish the food supply to some degree. And I see individuals such as Bill Gates going around buying up more farmland than anybody else in the United States. And I'm thinking there's something they have it ready to go here. So, oh, meat's bad for you. Let's go to this man-made meat. And if that runs short, now let the government come in and give you bread and circus to distract you, basically. So is there another aspect of food production control that you've noticed in these three areas?
So in some parts of the communist world, they tried to collectivize agriculture, and in other parts, they did not. So an example, so Poland never actually did collectivization. The most tragic story by far is Ukraine, where Stalin tried to force collectivization. And let me just say what collectivization is real quick. So the idea here is you might have 300 farmers in an area, and they would be, if they were collectivized, all 300 would have to sort of come together and create one big farm. Nobody then owned the individual ownership of cattle and of the tractors, things like that. That was all abolished. It was all supposed to be owned as a group. And then the produce was owned as well. So whatever you made, you had to share with the farmers and then also with the state, because the state, remember, Stalin is trying to industrialize. He's trying to beat the capitalists. And so the state requisitions and takes huge sums of grain from your production. And again, they actually believed that this system would outproduce the farming before, because it had just been backwards and people didn't know what they were doing. It was an absolute disaster. It's estimated that something like 7 million Ukrainians died in one of the worst famines of the 20th century. I say one of because sadly, in communist China, Mao outdid them, and there was the communist famines of the 70s had some, close to 30 million dead. But if you ever read about this, people who are starving do the worst things imaginable, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking, the most mild thing is they're eating dirt, but in the worst cases, they're eating people. They're eating family members, they're eating children. Sometimes their parents are killing themselves and telling their kids to eat them to help their kids so that their kids can survive. This is just the worst of what can happen, right? And the absolute pig-headed self-confidence that Stalin had. He knew this information was coming in. He knew this was happening, and he said, keep going. We need to take more grains from these people. We cannot tolerate any private agriculture. We have to collectivize at a faster pace. He was so, bizarrely convinced that he was right, that he just, single-handedly allowed 7 million people to die. So, that's the story there. Now, in Estonia, for example, they actually managed to avoid huge famines. Part of it is that Estonians had, maybe were more productive than they had been than the Ukrainians. Although Ukraine was known as the breadbasket. Thankfully, Estonia managed to avoid that, but they were also forced into collective farms. So they were rounded up, and if Estonians didn't want to join the collective farm, they were put on cattle cars and shipped east to work in slave labor camps. So some 60,000 Estonians were rounded up in a single night to try to force the Estonians onto collective farms. So that's sort of the vision, and that's sort of what happened.
Wow. All right. And I'm assuming because you know so much about the history of socialism, you probably see things that other people do not see. So, where are you located right now?
New Mexico, actually.
New Mexico. What
Yeah.
scares you the most about what's happening in the United States? Is there any type of correlation that is pretty obvious to you and to people like me, but maybe to not to everyone else?
Yeah, I mean, what worries me is that just as the socialists did, I see people who are playing on the appeal of socialism to obtain their own ends. So, when a company goes to the government and asks for a subsidy or asks for, a tariff on its competitors or asks for some sort of regulatory privilege or asks to outlaw its competitors, they often will appeal to the some of the same instincts I think that socialists would appeal to, our sense of fairness, our sense of, the collective good. But they have really themselves that they are trying to serve. And so that does, very much worry me. It does very much worry me that we're kind of missing the idea of what is it that allows us to live in this fabulously wealthy society? Why is it that the poorest 5% of Americans are wealthier than 68% of the globe? Well, in my mind, it has something to do with the fact that we live in a society that is mostly pretty free, and we have for a long time. You can start a business. You can set up your own business model and charge whatever you want. And if you don't get customers at that rate, then you might have to change your prices, but you're able to do that. And so it does worry me that we're like in the midst of this undreamed of wealth, and we don't have any idea of where it came from. We don't appreciate that it didn't happen by accident. It happened because we have an economically free society, and we need to work to preserve that.
Have you ever read anything about Edward Bernays at all, father of propaganda?
No, I don't think so.
So he wrote the book Propaganda, and he's related to, I believe it was Freud, but
Uh,
wrote the book, and Hitler actually said that that was a meaningful book to him in the 20s.
mm,
And so when you read that book, you realize like he followed the game plan for quite a bit when it comes to propaganda itself, one of which was getting the doctors on your side, right? Hitler went around and bought up the doctors and said, if you don't believe in me, then you're banned. And I said, oh my God, that's pretty similar. And then when it comes to, I mean, the school system and how they basically just instill it in you at a very young age, getting into the schools, getting into the media, it's very, very, very similar. But also, I mean, once you understand propaganda in general, you notice it in every socialist country. They control the media too. So, it's probably common, right? As soon as the government's involved, they control the media. You see it in Canada, but you see it pretty much everywhere else. I guess it's going to be everywhere else, including when it comes to what Stalin was able to implement total control of everything that was shown in movie theaters. I remember reading a story about how Stalin saw a movie that had something to do with like cars in America during the Depression, and he had the movie removed because individuals were looking at America saying, wait a second, you mean to tell me that all of this is happening, but they have cars? And he thought it would make America look bad and look evil, but people saw that they had cars and they did, and Americans had cars, but they didn't. So they started looking at capitalism as possibly the way. So total control of the media, and including now social media, is part of the socialist game plan, right?
yeah, absolutely. Everywhere throughout the socialist world, they control radio, they control TV, movies, as I mentioned, art, and the art was crappy. They had they had it was called socialist realism, and every painting looked the same, and it was this ridiculous propagandistic image of these people being, extremely prosperous in the future thanks to all the sacrifices that are going on today. If you want to know a crazy story, read about North Korea, Kim Jong-un. So he would be the son of the founder of the North Korean state. He was his father had been a revolutionary and kind of worked hard for the socialist state. He kind of grew up as a playboy. He didn't have to work very hard, and the one thing he loved was Western movies. He was obsessed with movies, and this actually helped him because he ended up being the head of propaganda. And that's partially why his dad made him the next leader. Well, he wanted to make North Korean movies. So in the late 70s, he actually kidnapped the biggest movie star in South Korea. It was like Julia Roberts of South Korea, right? He lured her, he had the secret agents lure her to a hotel in a meeting in Hong Kong about some kind of new movie. And then they put her on a boat and they took her to North Korea. And then she had previously been married to South Korea's biggest director, and they divorced. He then kidnapped her husband. Her husband actually was looking for her. Basically, same story. Got her, lured him onto this boat and took him to North Korea. He kept these people in North Korea for 6 years and forced them to make movies. Propagandistic movies about the North Korean state and the communist state and how wonderful it was. Many of them were just terrible movies. I guess they did a remake of Godzilla that people just still sort of made fun of. They ended up escaping. They managed to go. They were in the West. I think it might have been Germany. I can't remember. Maybe Austria, and they were supposed to be getting funding for a new movie. And they asked the guards to go outside while they talked with the people about the funding, and they jumped out the window, got in a cab, and tried to race to the airport. They get stuck in traffic. They end up, and they're followed by the KGB, or the equivalent of the KGB, the North Korean secret police, and they end up having to go on foot. And actually, I think they're going to the embassy, not the airport, the U.S. embassy. It's like, I can't believe this hasn't been made into a movie. It's so incredible. But
What year was this?
what's that?
What year was this?
So they were kidnapped in 1978, I believe, and then kept for about 6 years. It's just amazing.
Wow, man. And I got to check that out. I've never heard of that story.
Abduction
But
of
fear.
Shin Sang-ok. Her name is SHINSANG-OK. And you can read about it.
Oh my
Somebody needs to make that into an actual movie because it's incredible.
But fear, well, I mean, that's another part of it, right? So the moment you hear, I mean, it doesn't even make sense to us. There's that much fear instilled of you leaving, but there's this kidnapping is going on. The amount of propaganda, I mean, the amount of blackmailing. Who knows when it comes to whether it's
Yeah.
Epstein and all these other people? Blackmailing is a part of it. You leave here, you start going against what we have to say. Watch out for your life. Oh,
Mhm.
and then the aspect of we're all in this together. I think that was one other thing that I've noticed is that you're all grouped together, right? Even if it's, oh, we're all in this, none of us is safe unless all of us are safe or something like that. So it's very, very similar from generation to generation. The variables are different, but it's all the same playbook. And it's
Yeah.
so obvious to see. So, anyways, I could keep you all day, and I appreciate you giving us extra time, man. Thank you so much for doing
Yeah.
this. Guys, check out his books. And by the way, I didn't know where you stood. I knew you had certain feelings, but I didn't know exactly where you stood. It's very much in alignment with how I believe. So, great work, man. The Road to Socialism and Back, an economic history of Poland. The other one is the Free Enterprise Welfare State, history of Denmark's unique economic model. And the other one, I think this one just came out February of 2024, not too long ago. The Road to Freedom, Estonia's rise from Soviet vassal state to one of the freest nations on earth. Thank you so much, Matt Mitchell, for being here. I really appreciate your time, man.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And I'll make sure I have in the show notes a way to get in touch with with you. But is there a website or a social media channel that you recommend for people to follow you on?
Yeah, Realities of Socialism is kind of like the main hub, and we've got links to podcasts and videos and infographics and all kinds of stuff there that people can check out.
Beautiful. I think, yeah, I saw you on YouTube. I don't know if it was your YouTube channel, but you were on it. You had a couple interviews. Maybe it was Adam Smith Works. Somebody posted your
Yeah, yeah,
YouTube.
that's right.
So, anyways, guys, check out his book. Look him up on webs on social media, but also the website. I said realityisofsocialism.org, I believe. Is that
Oh,
correct?
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yep. Good deal. So, all right, guys, remember, $1 million book will lead to $1 million life, and stay capitalistic. All right. That's the key. That's what we're saying.
Mhm.